All right then, good morning everyone. My name is Mark Lantain. I'm a senior researcher here at NUPI, dealing with issues related to Chinese and East Asian foreign policy. I'm also the coordinator of NUPI's Europe-Asia Research Center, otherwise known as NEAR. And we're very pleased this morning to be hosting a very distinguished scholar as part of our NEAR lecture series, Professor Christopher Dent, who has just arrived here from the University of Leeds, going to be speaking on issues related to East Asia inside and out. And just to give a very brief bio, Professor Dent's primary interests lie in the area of Asia political economy, looking at various areas about Asia and the development of global society, more recently in the area of energy development, energy security. Very, very prolific writer and author. I was going through some of his most recent publications yesterday, and just to name two of the most recent, East Asian Regionalism, a book which was awarded the Masayoshi Ohira Foundation Prize in 2009. And most recently, I believe it was published back in November, Renewable Energy in East Asia Towards a New Developmentalism. I look forward to reading that. So thank you very much for coming, and we look forward to your presentation this morning.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much to NUPI for inviting me. Special thanks to Alana, who specifically invited me to come and give a talk to you today. I'm an international political economist interested in how East Asia is cohering together into some sort of regional entity, and at the same time, the impact of the region globally and how it is shaping, especially many of the challenges facing humanity in the 21st century, such as climate change, energy security, development gaps, food security, those kinds of issues. So, yeah, why does East Asia matter in relation to those challenges? Why is it an important region for us to study? How is it important? Why is it important for us to understand what's going on inside East Asia and its outside, thereby its outside impacts on the rest of the world? Well, let me first of all start by clarifying what I perceive to be East Asia, because there was always a little bit of maybe a different interpretations or understandings of what comprises East Asia. To me, this comprises both Northeast Asia, so China, Japan, the Koreas, include Taiwan, Mongolia, Russian Far East in there too, geographically, and then also Southeast Asia, primarily the 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. It has become a core element of the global economy and of the geopolitical order. Back in the 1950s, if you looked at the East Asian economy regionally, only comprised about 5% of global GDP. It now comprises 30% of world GDP, the global economy. So it's increased in its magnitude by a factor of 6 over those decades. It's been consistently the largest growing, or the quickest growing regional economy in the last 50 years, with growth rates on average between 7 to 10%. It has a very large number of emerging economies, not just China, but kind of second-order emerging powers like Indonesia, Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. And the region is having increasingly significant impacts on the rest of the world and how we are trying to cope with many of the increasingly acute challenges facing humanity in the current era. So what I want to look at is what have been the most recent developments, rather, in the East Asian region, especially from a political economic perspective. To what extent is the region integrating together, but also how is it fracturing as well? Mark mentioned the book I wrote in 2008-9 on East Asian regionalism. Then I was actually quite positive about the future of East Asian regionalism and how the nations of the region were coming together and becoming more collaborative. But now I'm actually at the end almost of writing the second edition of that book, and I'm not as positive as I was 7 or 8 years ago. There are a number of frictions within the region, and moreover, one thing I will note as I go through my talk is that many of the the most powerful states in East Asia are being drawn increasingly into the global sphere. They're not so much focused just on their region as they were perhaps in the aftermath of the financial crisis of 97, 98, and how the region tried to deal with that and to better manage regional economic interdependence. Now, especially China and also Korea and Japan are trying to manage global economic interdependencies and other interdependencies, which really are a feature of today's globalizing world. And that is having an impact on the regional affairs of East Asia. Okay, so just a map to help. I feel we've got great maps here. Don't really need it. This one in particular, you can just about see where I come from, which is Yorkshire, which is actually named after Norwegians, okay, Jorvik, and great Viking heritage we have. Half the towns in Yorkshire are actually named after, or named by the Vikings. So, okay, here we have, and we have this great lightsaber kind of dot here I can use, which I'll be using quite a bit because I love this kind of technology. So here we have China, of course, right slap bang in the center. And Southeast Asia, okay, this is kind of mainly seen as still South Asia, okay, around the Indian subcontinent, and then we have Myanmar, Burma here, down here to Indonesia, okay, the world's largest Muslim population, and then we have, of course, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, and so on over here. So that's the East Asia region. Now, looking at the East Asian or Asian economy historically, what's important to remember is it's only had a couple of bad centuries, essentially. That for most of recorded human history, Asia, and even East Asia, has been a major core element of the world economy. So we talk about kind of the emerging powers of Asia. Actually, they're re-emerging powers, you could say, especially China. But if we look at the Asian economy as a whole, because again, there's this sometimes confusion about what do we mean by Asia? When we mention Asia, what do we actually mean by that from a political economic perspective? If you're looking at this in kind of blunt GDP, gross domestic product terms, which is a proxy for economic power and weight, we see that, okay, this is Northeast Asia. Here, oops, sorry, no, I pressed the wrong button. Do apologize. This is Northeast Asia, this is Central Asia, this is South Asia, and this is Southeast Asia, okay? So this and this comprise East Asia. You can see just how much the East Asian economy dominates the Asian economy. If you're looking at GDP terms, it's about 90% of the total. If you look at trade, it's about the same, about 90, 92%. If you're looking at production, energy consumption, and so on, it's in the kind of 90s, late 80s, 90s%. So East Asia really dominates Asia in these respects. So what has actually been happening to the East Asian economy? How integrated has it become? What has happened to the regional economic affairs and relations of East Asia? So the title of this slide here is East Asia Integrates Again. If you go back many centuries, you'll find that in the kind of Indo-Pacific sphere, there were three great trading hubs: the Middle East, India, and China. So from East Asia's perspective, when the European maritime powers arrived in Asia and tried to make friends with Asians in their own particular way, from, say, the 15th, 16th centuries onwards, they already found actually quite a well-developed regional trading system in place. There was a lot of trade going on between East Asian societies and peoples, okay, around that time, and all the Europeans did was further develop those regional trading systems and subsume them into their own imperial divisions of labor. In the modern era, it was Japan, okay, we're talking from the 50s, 60s onwards, which reintegrated Asia together, especially its multinational enterprises. The big Zaibatsu group, which dominated the early period of Japan's industrialization in the early 20th century, were reformulated into the Keiretsu groups, companies like Toyota, Sony, Honda, Mitsubishi, and so on. In fact, this is here, the founding board of the Kawasaki company that was formed in the late 19th century. But along with their very strong partnership with the Japanese state, the developmental state, Japanese multinationals began to invest overseas, shifting lower cost production overseas, first to the first generation tiger economies of South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, but especially Taiwan and South Korea, as I'll show in a moment. And this started off a regionalized dynamic of development, okay, with these Japanese multinationals, as well as other multinationals from Europe and America, helping to develop this so-called Factory Asia phenomenon, which is, if you look at, for example, that screen back there, which my friend Osmond is reading from, that is probably a 65% chance that that was made by a Taiwanese company branded for another Asian company and produced in China. I'll come on to look at the kind of production network and supply chain aspects of East Asia's regionalism in a moment, but Japan was the one that spearheaded this idea that products were not just made in single countries, but in multiple countries all joined up together by these supply chain and production network linkages. Then we had problems in Japan, okay? The bubble burst in the late 80s, early 90s. Then China stepped into the fray and became the new regional motor of East Asia's integration. China started by making teapots, then went on to make flip-flops, and then more sophisticated products like laptops by the 1990s and 2000s and so on. So China has now kind of has actually continued the momentum of the East Asian economies, regional integration, and main impact onto the region's impact on the world economy. Then we have in Southeast Asia, quite ambitious for developing country group plans for regional integration, and I'll come on to ASEAN a bit later, but there's been quite interesting dynamic things happening in that part of East Asia. And a key factor in the development of East Asia's regional integration was the 1997-98 East Asian financial crisis, which did two key things. The first thing it did was expose the lack of regional cooperation mechanisms which East Asian countries had with each other to cope with crises which were region-wide. Okay, the lack of regional governance structures and coping mechanisms. Second thing it did, relatedly, was expose the extent to which regional economic integration had developed in the region up to that point. Because the crisis started as simply a currency crisis with the Thai currency, the baht, when it depegged its currency from the US dollar. And then it cascaded not into a currency crisis, but into a full-blown financial crisis, affecting stock markets, real estate, other asset prices. And I'll come back to that later. What I want to do first of all is focus on regionalization, which is a micro-level process happening mainly driven by non-state actors and particularly by business. Now, if you go back to when I was a young lad, as we say in Yorkshire, to the 1970s to 1980s, when people thought about East Asia, the main country they thought about back then was Japan, and the threat that Japan could cause, especially to the United States as the potentially dominant 21st century economic superpower. So I actually found this magazine, California Today, published in August 1978, in my mother's attic when I was clearing it out a few years ago. And you can see there's this interesting photograph of a Japanese samurai warrior in front of very high-tech computer data banks here with a samurai sword. This diagram here was in the same magazine. There we have the rising sun, the tentacles of Japanese kind of superpowerdom and technological prowess into the Bay Area there. I think that may be the Golden Gate Bridge. Yep, there you go. These are the kind of books that came out in the 1980s about trying to discuss, will Japan overtake the US as the world's #1 economy? What is the basis for this argument, and so on. And I'm sure some of you will recognize this still from a very famous film made in 1982. Anyone like to have a guess? Blade Runner, very good. This is Los Angeles in 2019, just 4 years from now. And this is trying to convey the idea that Japanese culture was overtaking or becoming more pervasive in American society. So this is a geisha girl advertising Coke on the side of a 100-story building, okay, which was typical of some of the films coming out at the time, looking at what was going to happen to American culture in the future. Now, of course, things didn't go according to plan for the Japanese. But let's see how they got there in the first place. This is a shameless plug for my new book, which there's the second edition of East Asian Regionalism coming out in the middle of next year. This is a graphic from which I lovingly drew myself from chapter 2. And what it shows is the development of Sony, which until a few years ago was the world's largest electronics manufacturer. Who can tell me which overtook Sony in that position? There's another. Samsung, very good, from Korea, thank you. Samsung started as a fish importing company, by the way, in the 1930s, interestingly. So here we go. Sony started to invest overseas in the 1960s and 1970s, and first to South Korea and Taiwan. And these show the factories that they established there, okay, in this first phase of their FDI, foreign direct investment overseas. And then after the yen was appreciated in the late 1980s, it started to push its foreign direct investment overseas to Southeast Asia because it became too expensive with a appreciating currency to keep exporting from Japan. So more and more of its overseas investment went to this part of East Asia, okay, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore mainly. And then a third phase of FDI happened in the context of China's economic reforms from the 1980s and 1990s onwards. But it was really in the 1990s that Sony and other firms from Japan and also South Korea increasingly began to invest overseas. So, okay, Sony and other electronic firms invest in South Korea. That helps companies like LG and Samsung develop their technological expertise and become world-beating firms themselves. They then begin to invest from the 1990s onwards in Southeast Asia and in China. In Taiwan, companies that you've never heard of before, probably, TSMC, Quanta. Quanta make this phone produced by Samsung in China. They began to invest, in fact, heavily. Taiwan companies are the biggest investor or one of the biggest investors in mainland China now. So this began to develop a self-reinforcing mechanism of regionalized development, where you had the lead goose in the flying geese formation, providing the cutting-edge technology, breaking down the wind resistance for the economies that followed it, and then when it got tired, it was replaced by China, which then provides further momentum for the rest of the formation. This is how Toyota makes cars in East Asia. Okay, over half of Toyota's production in Asia takes place outside Japan. So they have major factories. Oh no, sorry, I pressed the wrong button again. I'm getting a bit excited here, sorry, with this device. They have major factories, especially in Thailand, okay, Southeast Asia's biggest automobile producer, and also in China. These factories don't just make whole vehicles, they make parts and components like engines, transmission mechanisms, which are then sent to other parts of the regional production network, okay, for their production of cars like Yaris's and other cars that Toyota make, which I seem to have gone a blank on. So this is the Factory Asia phenomenon, again, here in the automobile industry. If you look at the figures, you'll find that only Europe has more intra-regional trade and investment than East Asia. So roughly about 52% of all trade that East Asian countries conduct is with other East Asian countries. And of East Asia's total trade, about 40% of it is not in finished products, but it's in components and parts. So very large percentage of East Asia's trade is actually exchanging parts and components within the same production network systems. And interestingly, the finished products which East Asia makes are mainly shipped to Europe and North America. Now, if you compare the intra-regional trade ratios of other parts of the world, if you take South Asia, for example, they only trade about 10% of their trade with each other. You go to Latin America, it's about the same. You go to Africa, it's about 5–10% of their trade is with other African nations. East Asia's is 55%. Okay, it's a highly integrated regional economy. That's the key point I want to get across. And it is still highly integrated. It has fallen slightly, that ratio, mainly because China is increasing its resource trade relationships with countries outside the region. Okay, for iron ores, energy, other raw materials that it needs to sustain its economic development. So the ratio has fallen slightly in the last few years. And that is connects to one of the key themes that I want to make, is that although all this integration is going on, and East Asian countries are talking more with each other, there's been a proliferation of dialogue frameworks, which I'll come on to in a moment, China is globalizing its economic relations in a way that's undermining the whole regionalism process in East Asia to some extent. This is a highly dense diagram, which I'm glad you've got photocopies, excellent quality photocopies, by the way, where you can see the main transportation hubs, air and sea transportation in East Asia. Now, I'm going to come on to a slide which simplifies this just in a moment, but basically what you have in East Asia are the world's largest air cargo hubs and the world's largest ports. And this facilitates the whole regional integration process. These ports and airports have become more important over time as more people, goods, and services are being exchanged within East Asia. So if you look at, for example, the top 10 ports, in 2004 globally, okay, Hong Kong #1, Singapore, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Busan, Kaohsiung. Okay, top 6 are all East Asian, okay? You don't have any other Asian ports below the top 6, and 3 of those are Chinese. Then you go to 2014, and you'll find that 10 of the top 12 seaports in the world, it's just normal kind of, actually, it's a containerized cargo, are East Asian, and 8 of them are Chinese. Okay, so they've gone from having 3 in the top 12 to 8 ports in the top 12. And you may have seen in the news the big explosion that happened at Tianjin, okay, the massive chemical explosion that took place there. That has had an enormous expansion in its facilities over the last 10 years. It's the 3rd largest conventional cargo port in the world, Tianjin, in terms of bulk cargo, okay, bulk materials like iron ores and energy fuels. So it's been facilitated, this huge development in regional integration, which has been sustained over 5 decades by these massive investments in regional infrastructure and the connections between them. Now, what about politics and diplomacy? What I've been talking about mainly is about business and infrastructure, okay, and trade. What about politics and diplomacy? Well, one of the interesting things about East Asia is, pause while workman does work, good, right, is that whilst at the kind of micro ground level, East Asia has been integrating like no other region in the world apart from Europe. East Asian governments haven't really been getting on that well weren't getting on that well, and really until the Cold War ended, which provided new geopolitical possibilities. If we look at a map of regional organizations to which East Asian countries are party to, security plays a big role in actually explaining why these came about and how they've developed since then. So the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, arguably the most effective and successful developing country regional organization in the world, was formed in 1967 for two key security reasons. One was to stop Southeast Asian countries fighting each other in the early 1960s, and the second was to establish a kind of redoubt of kind of liberal capitalism in a zone where communism was advancing. So the Americans were very much supporting the development of ASEAN at this time, but it didn't really do much until the early 1990s. It only had one summit in, say, 20 odd years, in 1976, I think it was. And then it had its second summit in 1991, 92, something like this. I think it was 92. And this was established because they had to make sense of the new post-Cold War security order. And what they decided back then in the early 1990s was to establish a free trade area, because this was what other parts of the world were doing, okay? We shifted from a focus of geopolitics and geopolitical competition to geoeconomic competition, where you shifted from a bipolar world of contestation between the United States and the Soviet Union mainly, to a tripolar world of geoeconomic competition between the US, European Union, and Japan, stroke East Asia. So ASEAN established this free trade area project called AFTA, which it established 10 years later, or concluded 10 years later in 2002-03. Then we had down here APEC, which comprises 21 member economies, including the United States, Japan, China, Russia. That was established in 1989, mainly by the Japanese and the Australians. And again, that was formed just as the Cold War was coming to an end. And then we have more recent developments. Okay, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was established by China to manage one of its regional neighborhoods with Central Asian states in 1996. And then we had the ASEAN +3, which is an extension of ASEAN diplomacy to include Japan, China, and South Korea. And this was really, or has developed into a regional governance structure to manage the regional economic interdependence post the 97-98 financial crisis. Now, ASEAN +3 is a regional framework, a diplomacy framework, but it's developed some very interesting mechanisms. Probably the most important one is the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization system of trying to improve the governance of currency transactions and interactions between East Asian states. I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm going to talk a bit about this in a bit later as well, but the Northeast Asian Trilateral Cooperation Framework is only between Japan, China, and South Korea, and this was formed in the 1990s. And then the East Asia Summit was established in 2005, originally based on ASEAN +3 plus India, Australia, and New Zealand, but now also includes the countries of Russia and the United States. What you tend to find, and this maybe applies to all regional organizations, is that the bigger they get, the more difficult they become to manage, and thereby the more difficult they are to achieve ambitious regional integration goals. APEC has found this out on a number of occasions. This is a group which includes Papua New Guinea, Japan, and the United States. trying to establish any regional economic projects, such different countries with disparate economic interests, has been extraordinarily difficult to do. What APEC and other large kind of grand regional groups like East Asian Summit have to really do, I think, is to focus on global issues. How may they be considered like a constituency in global society? So, for example, at APEC, they had been talking about developing, or they talked a few years ago, back in 2011-12, about developing a plurilateral trade agreement on environmental goods. And they developed some sort of program for this, and then this was then graduated to the WTO. At the East Asia Summit meetings, which are held towards the end of the year, tagged on to the end of the ASEAN Summit meetings and the ASEAN +3 Summit meetings, they mainly talk about how we can help develop our own views on global issues. So, for example, they'll be talking in a couple of months, I would imagine, on the big climate change talks in Paris, going to be held the month afterwards in December. Okay? So they perform a certain, what I call, multilateral utility, these big groups. Not just discussing regional affairs, but how they may be considered a regional constituency which speaks about what they feel on global issues. Okay? And take some actions where they can in that respect. Okay, so that's what's been happening to regional organizations. I'll come back to them a bit later. When we look at trade, and trade is probably the most important determinant of economic diplomacy and affairs between East Asian states, and I guess most states. What has happened has been quite transformative and quite profound in the last 15, 20 years. This is a picture of free trade agreement activity in the Asia Pacific. So here we have, as I mentioned earlier, the AFTA project, okay? ASEAN putting this in place. This is 1997, so just on the time when the financial crisis occurred. Here we have NAFTA, North America, US, Canada, Mexico, Central and America, South America here. These were all the FTAs that were in place in 1997. These are the FTAs now in place in 2015. This has been called the spaghetti bowl, or if you want to Asianize it, the noodle bowl. Most of these are bilateral. About 90% of these agreements are actually bilateral. So China has just done one with Japan and South Korea, and China recently. The China-Australia one is being debated by the Australian Parliament at the moment, and quite heatedly. So what we have here is a real mess of bilateral FTAs. Each FTA is different, very different to the other. So governments have been signing all these, and business has been telling them enough. You know, when I'm in Singapore, I don't have to deal with 20 different free trade agreements, thank you very much, depending on where I'm exporting to, because each FTA has its own rules about how you can trade, what you can trade, and what regulations you have to comply with at the other end of the market. So what's happened since the mid-2000s, business has been trying to get governments to rationalize this whole process and to form regional free trade agreements. So what do we have at the moment? We have AFTA, which has been in place for 10 years. We have NAFTA down here, which has been in place for 20 years. The dotted line ones are the ones which have been negotiated at the moment. So the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership includes all the East Asian states, plus Australia, New Zealand, and India. Then we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is also being negotiated at the moment down here, which is based on APEC member states, or member economies. So it's mainly been driven by the US, and the US has a very hard template for any FTAs it does, because its negotiators know that it has to comply to a certain model on things such as intellectual property rights, financial services, investment, for it to pass through US Congress. Okay, it's hands are tied more or less by US domestic politics. The RCEP is far more flexible because the Asians are far more pragmatic, and they also all have quite a similar ideational view or conceptual view on what an FTA should be about, which is economic partnership. Not just about liberalizing trade and investment, but also about regional economic cooperation and development capacity building. Now, the TPP has had 40 rounds of negotiations so far. Okay, 40. It's 3 years ahead of RCEP, but RCEP, in my view, is, if it is going to be concluded, because even this is a large ask, because again, you've got such disparate economies, and you've also got China and Japan involved in this negotiation. Its chances of success are also quite slim, but not as slim as in my which they're trying to conclude, but it's having problems. And I can take questions on that if you like later. But in my view, there's a good chance that the TPP will not be signed. But I can take questions on that later if you like. So, I mentioned China and Japan. Now, when you hear about China and Japan in the news, what kind of things come up normally in the media? What kind of debates and issues come up? Yeah, okay, history issues, territorial disputes, basically friction, yeah? Them not getting on. But the Chinese and the Japanese are probably each other's most important economic partner. Moreover, with the South Koreans, trilaterally, these three nations have been developing all kinds of cooperation across a number of functional areas since the late 1990s. Again, this was in response to the 97-98 financial crisis mainly, but you can actually see the antecedents of Northeast Asian regional cooperation going back to the late 1980s. And if you read my book, when it comes out next year, you'll see the full story of this. I'm glad you got the handouts, because you can see these are different functional areas in which they have been talking on a regular basis and at summit levels, informal summits since 1999, okay, hosted by ASEAN countries, tagging on the end of ASEAN summits. And formal summits, okay, sometimes they don't happen, since the late 2000s. But you've got quite well-developed regional cooperation in Northeast Asia and economy. They've had a trilateral investment treaty in place since last year. They've had 7 or 8 rounds, negotiations on a Northeast Asia free trade agreement as well, okay, since last year. Finance, environment. Environment was one of the early areas of functional cooperation, by the way, from 1999 onwards. Transport and logistics, science and technology, intellectual property and standards, commerce, health, agriculture, society, and culture. If you look at cities between China, Japan, and South Korea have been talking with each other quite a bit. Cities, in my view, are going to be one of the most important emerging actors of the 21st century world. So watch out for that one. I talked about cities earlier, yeah, as transportation hubs, but they also are performing interesting diplomatic portfolios, especially in climate change and energy and environment. Seoul, metropolitan government, Tokyo, other forward-thinking governments, Singapore, are also getting more involved in this new emerging area of 21st century diplomacy, okay, in environment and energy and climate change. But, of course, at the same time, you have all this formalized dialogue frameworks going on, regional integration projects going on in Northeast Asia. You have some major fractures and frictions. You have the South China Sea. I don't need to go into this in any great detail. I think most of you know the issue there. That's China's claim, the infamous 9-dotted line, okay, extending all the way down here. Then you have the territorial dispute over the Dokdo Takeshima Islands between Japan and South Korea. Then you have the East China Sea territorial dispute between China and Japan down here. Hydrocarbons is one of the key issues driving that territorial dispute, as is the prospect of very large gas and oil fields being in the South China Sea as well, okay, with China doing island building and all the rest of it. So you have a lot of different things going on here, parallel and simultaneous to each other, complex stuff going on in functional cooperation, complex security problems going on mainly in maritime zones in the region. Now, what about the rise of China? How is this causing some structural changes, important structural changes in East Asia? Well, I mentioned earlier about how it's been the return of China, more the kind of the rise of China. It's been the re-rise of China, so to speak. And it's becoming a dominant player in all these different fields. Okay, production, trade, finance, energy, technology, development, cooperation, security, environment, resources. It's gradually eclipsed Japan over the last 10 years especially as East Asia's primary superpower. Accommodated China's rise as being absolutely critical to understanding East Asia itself, okay, its relations with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, as well as Southeast Asia. And to quote Spider-Man's dad, was it? With great power comes great responsibility. And how is China coping with that challenge? It's growing very fast. It's making impacts on all fronts very quickly. How quickly is it learning itself about how to accommodate its own rise regionally and globally? To me, the one image which captures China's economic growth, modernization, and impact is this. This is Pudong in 1990. This is Pudong in 2013. Okay, this skyline of the Pudong district in Shanghai, to me, is a very potent symbol of how China has changed. Now, if you look at the different areas of political economy, economics, where these changes have taken place, you can look at them at your own leisure. I won't go through all of them, but what you find is that China, for example, gross domestic product 1990, was the 11th largest economy in the world. Now it's the second. Exports, the 9th largest in the world, now the first. Even in terms of stock market capitalization, only the Chinese have a bigger stock market than the, so only the US has a bigger stock market now than China. In China, they also like to patent a lot of their technologies and trademarks. It patents twice as many trademarks now as the United States does. You can look at this at your leisure, but the key date was here, back in, when was it? 2009, when China's economy overtook Japan's. And this has meant that China as well, by reaching into kind of high global rankings, has become more of a global player and not just a regional player. Now, in terms of finance, this is probably one of the most interesting areas to look at in some detail. After the 97-98 financial crisis, East Asian foreign exchange reserves, which is the kind of excess money they have left over from all their dealings with international economic transactions, were quite low. As a national security measure, all East Asian countries, more or less, decided to accumulate more and more foreign exchange reserves. So if you look at China, for example, which started off with just $2.5 billion of foreign exchange reserves in 1980, it now has over $4 trillion. What does it do with those $4 trillion? It mainly invests them in US government securities. So these foreign exchange reserves have come from China exporting its final products mainly to the US and also Europe. That gives it a surplus. How has that surplus come about? Where does China get its trade surpluses from? It's mainly from foreign multinationals from the US and Europe who've gone to China to produce their products to sell back to their original home markets, okay, back in Europe and the United States. What does China do with this surplus cash? It gives it to the Americans. It's a beautiful thing. It's called Chimerica, okay, this kind of superfusion of two economies basically into one. Now, these are very high levels of economic interdependence. What implications that has for China's security relationship with the United States is a very interesting question. Would either want to go or to ramp up a major conflict with each other when the Chimerica economy exists? Yeah? How have the United States had such low interest rates and inflation for the last 20 years? I would argue it's because we've allowed China to become the cheap, affordable, competitive production base for the global economy. Anyway, I'll take questions on that later, if you like. But interestingly, on finance, I mentioned the Chiang Mai Initiative earlier and how it's multilateralized in 2010. The East Asians have not used this mechanism to help each other out, even in the turbulence caused by the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. Interestingly, the South Koreans and the Singaporeans didn't go to that system. They didn't go to the Chinese or the Japanese to help them out. They went instead to the United States to help them out. Moreover, what China has done is since the global financial crisis, it's signed over 30 bilateral currency swaps with other countries. It hasn't opted to fortify this regional system. It's sought to globalize its financial relationships. This is, you probably heard about the Silk Road, Maritime Silk Road, Iron Silk Road projects. This is, again, China trying to reach out of the region, literally, physically. I heard my friend in the Asian Development Bank told me the other day that a few months ago, computer components made in China were transported on bulk in train to Europe, arrived in Hamburg 10 days later. Now, I'm not too sure what quantities we're talking about here, but that's roughly 5 or 6 times quicker than if those components were sent by sea on a container from one of those ports I mentioned earlier in China. China is trying to link up the Eurasian landmass through these projects. It has all this money. What is it doing with it? It's building infrastructure. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is grown in interest. Countries like Britain, other European countries, I don't know if Norway signed into it. Yes, it has. Thank you, Otto. But China is globalizing all kinds of economic relationships at the moment, not just confining itself to the region. Okay, finally, because I know I've only got, I've got -1 minute left. Sorry, Mark. Energy and environment. I just wanted to touch on development and climate change. I wanted just to touch on one area that's become increasingly interesting to me, which is the impact of East Asia on energy security and climate change. And my renewable energy book in East Asia looks at this relationship in some detail. East Asia's economic development has been extraordinarily energy intensive because it's been industrialization, urbanization driven. Yeah? These are the comments from Park Chung-hee, the long president of South Korea. Dark smoke rising from our chimneys is a symbol of the nation's growth and prosperity, and steel is national power. So a very kind of industrialization-driven form of growth, and dark smoke, hey, that's great, because we're moving ahead, we're prospering. But of course, now East Asians are counting the environmental costs of this energy and material-intensive modernization. Primary energy demand. This is projections going forward for the next few decades. You can see Asia, and that includes India, is on a completely different trajectory to the rest of the world, okay, up to 2040. CO2 emissions correspondingly, because CO2 emissions or climate change is mainly caused by energy combustion. Asia, again, on a different trajectory there to the rest of the world, counting for about, again, 40% of the global total. China overtook the US in 2006 as the world's largest CO2 emitter, and you can see the blue area here. This is East Asia, Asia Pacific, the main bulk of carbon emissions globally. East Asians know they have to do something about this. Pollution is killing or causing the premature deaths of between 1.2 and 1.3 million Chinese every year, and it's rising. It's become a difficult place to work in many respects, Chinese cities. Water is running out. You have the securitization, therefore, of energy, climate change, food, water, and resources. Basically, they need to find a new way of doing development, okay, new developmentalism, as I call it. And what my renewable energy in East Asia book looks at is how renewable energy fits into a bigger kind of paradigm of new development thinking in East Asia. And it combines state capacity thinking with ecological modernization thinking. That is a revitalization of the state's role in economic development, combined with the ideas of ecological modernization, which first came about in Europe in the 1980s, that have gradually pervaded East Asian society in the last 10 years. So China began to develop ecological modernization documents about 10 years ago. Its national climate change strategy came out in 2007. If you look at its 5-year plans, they're increasingly influenced by ecological modernization thinking, which is essentially, how can businesses make money and us still save the environment? It's trying to reconcile capitalism with environmentalism. It has been highly criticized, okay, this approach, and there are some issues with it, which I can take questions on. But this is what is driving now China and other East Asian countries forward to become more low-carbon development-oriented, more sustainable in their own way, but still modernizing. That's the key issue. Are these reconcilable things? Right, China emits more carbon emissions than the rest of the world, well, not the rest of the world, sorry, more than any other nation. It is consuming more energy by far than any other nation. At the same time, it's making solar power increasingly affordable and is driving certain technological improvements in the sector. So this is a sector, by the way, solar PV, which is growing between 30 and 40% a year in terms of equipment manufacture. So those are the figures there. Those show the increase in global solar PV capacity from 2006 to 2013. Over that 7-year period, it's grown very, very quick. Who makes solar panels and modules? Increasingly the Chinese, okay? The red ones indicate Chinese producers. The orange ones, other Asian producers. So there's only one non-East Asian company in the top 10 of solar PV manufacturers. Now, I know it's bad news for Norwegian company like REC, who moved all their production and technology development, I think, to Singapore recently. But China, even though there have been trade disputes over the dumping of cheap solar from China in the US, Japan, and European Union, the Chinese are still making green energy affordable. Similar thing is happening in the wind energy industry, which has grown by about 15 to 20% a year globally, and it's still a much bigger sector than solar. Again, it's the Chinese that have been driving this. Okay, in 2010, they became the world's largest installer of wind energy, and they have 4 of the top 10 wind turbine producers, with Vestas from Europe, Denmark. Hey, any Danes here? No? Okay, well done anyway, Vestas, for remaining the world's largest wind turbine producer, but the Chinese are now making also growing impacts on this new energy sector. So, to summarize, thank you for bearing with me, by the way, because I like to be normally punctual. But just to summarize then, what we have is in East Asia, a complex set of fracturing and integrating factors in East Asia's regional affairs. A lot of still promising things, bringing East Asian countries together, but also increasing fractures and frictions, and you can relate maybe some of this to accommodating China's rise. Is it a question of just cold politics, hot economics? A term that's often been used to describe regional international affairs in East Asia. China's rise and East Asia's continued rise in the global economic system. China has been making East Asia increasingly important in the global economy, but at the same time, it's globalizing its economic relationships, moving away from just trying to develop them in its regional neighborhoods. And it has many, okay? Central Asia, South Asia, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific, I guess you could say as well. So the interplay between the regional and global is becoming increasingly important for East Asia as its emerging and existing superpowers become more global in their outlook and interconnections. So that, in summary, I think is how I'd like to conclude my talk. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very, very comprehensive, very, very precise overview of what's happening in the area of Asia cooperation right now. So it gives me great pleasure now to invite two discussants who will be giving just a very brief overview as well as some comments and questions for you. First up, researcher Ren Yenny Lindgren here at NUPI, specialist in Japanese foreign policy and security policy, as well as Greater East Asia. Thank you.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. First, thank you, Chris, for an excellent presentation. I think you covered so many of the dynamics of a very large region, but also some of the subtleties that are happening in East Asia, which is important to also think about a bit. I have just a few personal reflections and then also a couple of questions related to your work, but also to your presentation. First, I have to say, I think that you captured the dynamics of what is going on in a region, and some of the worst and some of the world's most powerful economies are part of this region. But we also have to really keep into mind the importance of traditional and non-traditional security issues in this region, some of which you touched on today. And why this is important is because these are issues that many other parts of the country are also facing, and they're looking to East Asia as kind of a guidebook for how they can possibly address these coming issues in the years coming. So I very much agree with your inside leading to outside dynamic that you introduced, not only because what happens inside East Asia will happen, what happens outside East Asia, but also because the outside is constantly looking at East Asia to try to help them with their own problems. So kind of East Asia is a case study, I think, for many countries. I'd like to bring up one component of change in East Asia that underlies many of the region's challenges, and that's demographics. And it's a really broad issue here, but what I'd like to focus on here is just the shifts that we're seeing in the larger economies in East Asia, and I mostly East Asia by saying East Asia, I mean Japan, China, and Korea, South Korea. These are among the fastest aging populations in the world today, and their low birth rates and higher life expectancies are creating a scenario which makes it very difficult for them to cope with dealing with their citizens, both monetarily, health-wise, but also on a security level, right? And so this affects naturally also their labor forces and their makeup. And when you have your labor force affected, there's the very obvious reduction in labor force, but there's also the very subtle factors. For example, a reduction in labor force can also lead to less innovation, less creativity. And this is something that I think Japan has already begun to struggle with quite a bit, but other countries are looking to East Asia to get some kind of tips on how to address this. There's also the social welfare consequences, which I just mentioned, being able to take care of the country's elderly populations, but also general populations physically and also monetarily. But this, I think is something of a bigger global change that we're seeing in many countries, low birth rate society, aging population. And so what I would like to ask is how you think the demographics will affect the role of East Asia in the world, if this will have a significant impact in how East Asia is viewed in the world, and how so. So that is my first question relating to demographic security. The second and somehow related issue I'd like to elaborate on a little bit is the need for structural reform in East Asia. Many commentators argue that East Asian countries, and especially China, are very much investment-driven. And in particular sectors such as the property market, infrastructure, and public works, and they hence see the need to make these economies more of a consumer-driven economy. And in order to be more self-sufficient and less dependent on the export sector for economic growth, employment, and increased affluence, this really is important for these countries. Also, it has been stated many times that the East Asian countries, especially China, Japan, and South Korea, again, suffer from quite a prevalent culture of corruption, and in particular when it comes to the political sector. So in order to become more efficient in their use of limited resources, such as labor, capital, and natural resources, many of these countries are suggested that they should focus on reform, political and economic reform. In the country that I'm most familiar with, Japan, political economic reform is kind of a key word you hear all the time in political and economic circles. But the reality is it's a very hard thing to implement. And this is even the case for leaders and prime ministers that have the great support of the business community. So a major challenge, I think, on this end. So what I would like to hear your opinion about is on what East countries can do to implement in terms of structural reforms, and also what they need to implement, but also what degree you foresee the transformation of the East Asian countries in this regard, if this is actually something that's going to happen and is feasible.
Great.
My last question is related to something that I think you have quite a large area of expertise on, and that's sustainable environmental development in the East Asian region. With such a large share of the population of the planet and with such a high economic growth rates, these countries' contribution to global climate change emissions is already at a very historically high level, and it will likely grow in the future. But not only when it comes to global environmental change is East Asia important, but also, as you've mentioned, on the regional level and also particularly on the local level, bringing it down really to the smaller levels. The pollution of rivers, agricultural areas, and the ocean, and the aggressive exploitation of all kinds of resources of energy and labor makes sustainable development a more and more urgent issue in East Asia, in my opinion. Since renewable energies is one of your key areas of specialization, I thought I could ask you to share your opinion on how you think East Asia will tackle this structural development reform challenge going forward, and also to what extent regional organizations will enhance the country's abilities to do so. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ren. Great. Shall I answer those questions now, or shall I wait for Otto to...
Well, we'll have our
yeah, sure, they'll take
second
it together.
discussion, then we'll collect
Okay,
comments
great.
at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you
Good.
very much. Okay. And our second discussant, we're very pleased to have with us Mr. Otto Malmgren from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, specifically from the China desk. Thank you very much. Check.
Yep. 1, 2, 3.
Good.
Yeah, very good. Well, once again, thank you very much for your presentation. Parsing this information is it's going to take some time. But I've also read up on your other materials, and I'm very fascinated by your difference between regionalism and regionalization. And I think from a Norwegian standpoint, this is a very important differentiation. Norway has been part of the regionalization process since the 1800s through shipping, traffic lanes, which also then comes back to the Chinese concept of connectivity that Xi Jinping is pushing out today, through then, of course, the One Road, One Belt initiative, which certainly includes Asia. It's a global issue, but it's very much an Asian thing. I mean, it's not about bypassing Asia. It's about including and globalizing Asia, which is another issue that's really interesting. And I think Norway's been a part of the Asian economy for a very long time. I was just at a presentation at the Chinese embassy where the role of Chinese seafarers during the Second World War was discussed, and it's sailing on Norwegian ships. And it's only the British sailors that had a higher casualty rate on Norwegian ships than Chinese. So there has been this interconnectivity between Norway and Asia as such for a very long time due to shipping. We also see our engagement within industry as being very bound towards shipping. It's paint, it's chemicals, it's offshore, onshore, it's services. It has a whole range of issues that is very much makes us both a trading with Asia, but we also trade within Asia. And there was a study done by NUPI that came out in December 2013 that was commissioned by the Minister of Foreign Affairs that very much maps this out. So I won't go in detail, but I recommend the report definitely. As for regionalization and regionalism, I'm curious about the question between security and trust. ASEAN is as much a trust-building experiment as it is a regionalism experiment. It's about creating. I mean, Thailand and Cambodia has border issues. Philippines and Malaysia has border issues. You have the South China Sea question. There are resources. There are all these different competing interests that come within that framework of trying to create a body of interest. For Norway, this is interesting, as we just became sector dialogue partner with ASEAN. It's our 4th largest trading partner as a trading bloc in the world. Only it's by far out, dwarfed by the EU. But then China is number 2, and the US is number 3, and then ASEAN is there. If we were to make Northeast Asia as a trading bloc, it would be enormous. Our trade with South Korea and Japan is also quite significant, and with China, of course, then adding to that, it would be very different. And of course, also the Norwegian pension funds investments in Asia is only the U.S. has actually a larger portfolio than Asia. So we have a big interest in Asian security as well, because stability is a key word for the region, right? So I'm a little bit interested in seeing how you look at these different regional get-togethers as a trust-building mechanism. I think it's one of those things we talk a lot about within the UN. It's just lack of strategic trust. But I think one of the places which is fragmented on a normative level, they don't have a comprehensive agreement. There are all these other. The spaghetti bowl indicates that there's very little cohesiveness to this. It's very fractal, it's very bilateral, and we have to look within that framework. And so, as a trust-building mechanism, same goes then for the introduction of new financial multilateral institutions such as AIIB, or further development of the ADB, and how this actually plays into the region and also helps in globalizing Asia, which is another issue. Then, the paradox of Asia, and this also then is Asia as a bigger role, it also includes India, is that as Asia is becoming a middle-income region, it's still the place where we find the most poor people on the planet. It's by far the largest number of people living in abject poverty. And many of the people who actually live as middle-income families are only a few cents above poverty line. So there's a bad day at work and you're poor again. It's a very mixed issue. And will the region actually be challenged by this? Because I don't think it's not necessarily all about poverty relief, which is very much a part of the Norwegian government's agenda, but is also how do you engage the countries in such a way that poverty is not also then becoming the factor that binds them together. And I think that's really worth looking at. And finally, the last question is on environment. With climate change, Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia will be the region that sees probably the biggest impact on, along with the Pacific, on from climate change. It will be very arid, desert-like in the north. It will be very wet and flooding in the south until then the third pole, the Himalayas, finally melt everything, and then you're going to see waterways drying out, which means also transportation lines are drying out, and also trade connections. And we have to look at then what does this do for the security architecture for the region. This also now, with the interest that both Pakistan and India now are accepted as members of the SCO, full members, not just observers. Oh, right. And that's going to change also the way that maybe that part of the region is.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much, Otto.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's great.
Keeping cognizant of the time,
Yeah.
can ask you now to maybe make some brief comments
Succinctly
based
summarize.
on... Yeah.
Yes.
So, and then we can open the floor to some questions.
Sure thing.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful to Ren and Otto for providing such an excellent response and really interesting, intriguing questions. I found it very stimulating, very interesting. Demographic change, aging, Ren, yeah, it's really, really important issue. I guess it tends to be looked at still from a kind of domestic perspective, but Japan's already got quite a pronounced inverted demographic pyramid. You can see some scary stats on projections of Japan's population by 2040, where over half the people are going to be age 60 and above. It's one of the faces some enormous challenges, and you can only solve it by so many robots, right? So this is an interesting challenge, especially for Japan, but also, as you say, for South Korea, also Taiwan, and also China is aging as well as we speak. For Japan, given that it's had, shall we say, some challenges in accommodating foreign outside communities, this is especially tricky. And it draws upon the wider issue that's actually facing Europe as well, because we have lots of aging populations. If you look at Italy, for example, it's quite a similar profile, demographic profile, and projections for Japan. What do you need in an aging society? You need more young people. Where are you going to get them from? And this is obviously a big issue in the news at the moment with migrants coming from its peripheries. Same for East Asia. If you look at movements of people across East Asia, it's a small fraction but growing. The estimates and statistics on labour migration are notoriously bad, but it is happening increasingly. But Japan and also South Korea, they do face some real challenges on accommodating more people from outside their countries to come in and help provide economic stimulus, shall we say, in the longer term. Structural changes, production, consumption, middle class, especially, I guess, in China. Yeah, the rise of the middle class generally and of the Asian consumer is going to be one of the major factors driving the world economy in the next few decades, I believe. I mentioned earlier that a lot of what East Asian countries produce as final products, especially in China, ends up actually in the United States and Europe. That may change, yeah? The percentage may change in terms of them directing more and more of their laptops and cars and fridges and other kind of material products to East Asian markets instead of traditional Western ones. One interesting thing that's happening in China, just relatedly, is how China is trying to move, and you can already see this in the current 12 five-year plan, and I'm sure you'll see it even more so in the 13th five-year plan that will be in play next year, is how China's trying to move to more indigenous innovation, brand and technology-driven growth, more emphasis on the qualitative aspects of economic growth, and not just the quantitative end figures of GDP growth. So that not just looks at what kind of, do we want to have more lower growth figures, but it be more sustainable growth? Do we want to have a growth that's driven more by technology rather than just material inputs, outputs? Famous Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter said that you can have a steam train and you can keep adding carriages to it and it grows, but it's still a steam train. So what kind of engines, to use a pun or allegory here, does China want to have at the head of its economic train going forward, so to speak? Corruption, that's basically due to the very close traditional developmental state links between business and government, the Iron Triangle, in Japan between big business, the Keiretsu, Keidanren, the economic bureaucrats in Japanese government, and the politicians, mainly the LDP. I think that is a deep cultural structure. And you see this in South Korea, you see this in different ways with state-owned enterprises. It's in Singapore, Malaysia, where you have very strong links between business and government. And I don't think that's going to go away quickly. So that will remain a challenge. It's all to do with good governance, isn't it? You can have close business-state relations, but just how smart are those relations? How smart is the governance structure? It's not that they're necessarily bad, these links, but just what are they? What is the quality and the nature of them? Your question on sustainable development, number 4, links to Otter's number 3 about climate change and the securitization of environment. Kind of switching to your issue first. It's a really, really good way of looking at it, Otto, actually. I think that they know East Asia, as well as South Asia, India, Bangladesh, talked about the melting snows and rising sea levels. Bangladesh is one of the most climate change risk susceptible nations in the world. It's very, very flat. It's got huge floodplains and everything. They know that they are at risk. Yeah, the Taiwanese, they take it extraordinarily seriously. When mudslides kill a few 100,000 people due to extreme weathers, they're taking it really seriously. They know that it's actually killing people. I mentioned about 1.2, 1.3 million people in China dying every year or prematurely because of air pollution, even more than smoking. They know that it's killing people, and they are taking it more seriously. And all these things are related. Yeah, air pollution, and the Chinese government in March this year declare war on pollution. What actual actions will follow from that is another matter. But now moving seamless, your question, Ren, was more about kind of you mentioned about regional organizations helping to address climate change issues. All I can say is East Asians, from a regional point of view, regional cooperation point of view, is they're talking about it. But in terms of actual actions, there's not much going on. It's very much addressed through national environmental policy actions and agendas, and also, interestingly, globally as well. The regional is kind of bypassed because climate change is seen as a global problem or a national problem that affects votes and how strongly people feel about who they're being governed by. It's not necessarily seen as a regional problem. So they're talking about it, East Asians, but they're mainly directing their efforts either nationally or globally. So yes, Norwegian shipping and sailors. Yes, I knew this, how important Norway has been in the development of maritime relations between Asia and Europe. And in fact, Alana and I are working on a project which looks at, if I can move off camera slightly, I don't know if I'm still on camera anyway. If my map of Eurasia on the right here looks at the Eurasian landmass, the quickest way by ship, of course, between Asia, or most of Asia, especially Northeast and East Asia, between there and Europe, is not through the Suez Canal, it's over the top of Russia, the Northern Sea route. Norway is the first country that ships from Asia over that route will come to, if you count out Russia. So Norway has a key role in that possible long-term development that we're looking at in our project together. And the issue of regional organizations' role in strategic trust building, it's a socialization of diplomats at various levels, which are important, I think, in this respect. Notwithstanding all the noise we hear in the media about the conflicts between Japan and China, Japan and South Korea in the South China Sea, and so on, there's actually quite a lot of trust building going on in the background. And one key thing to remember is, in this whole process, is that when we look at the Chinese state and the Japanese state or government and the South Korean government and so on, these are quite large, complex organizations with many components. You have to understand intrastate politics. That is, what goes on within the state. Because, for example, in China, you've got the Ministry of Science and Technology guys who are quite kind of enlightened and forward-thinking when China goes to invest in Africa. Then you've got the kind of mining people and the finance people who have a different agenda in the Chinese government. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan has a different kind of agenda to the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in the Japanese government. You have to really look at what goes on internally within these governments to understand the whole strategic trust building, because there's a lot of trust building going on between certain ministries and certain governments internationally, but not, and then problems between other ministries and other governments internationally or diplomatically. So that is key to understanding, I think, how East Asian governments are building strategic trust with each other through regional organizations. Japan and China, and also South Korea, are interesting case studies, I think, in that respect. Poverty alleviation, lastly. Lest we forget, in the last 30 years, China's brought 500 million people out of poverty through its economic reform process, the biggest single reduction of poverty alleviation globally in the history of humankind, as far as we know. China is also playing a role in development cooperation and shaping the development cooperation agenda through working in Africa, other parts of Asia, Latin America, and the idea of how do we address poverty alleviation in Asia? Well, if you look at how China is trying to close the development gaps within its own society between a coastal southern northeastern zones which are becoming quite prosperous and the peripheral interior provinces which are remaining quite poor, why is China having to demand so much energy and develop foreign energy relationships? It's to secure the energy supplies needed to close those development gaps domestically and to ensure that those tensions internally do not overspill into serious political challenges. I think that understanding poverty alleviation in China is how do we, as outside the country, understand it? We have to look at, well, how are they looking at poverty alleviation themselves? In Southeast Asia, I haven't got as much knowledge, but it's trying to understand their own development experience, I think, over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and where they've come from. This is why you mentioned actually, Ren, about how other regions look to East Asia for lessons. They especially look to East Asia for how did they achieve their dynamic economic development sustained over 4 or 5 decades. That's why other developing countries tend to listen more to East Asian countries about development because they've recently been through that transformation process than often Western development donors. So some interesting debates going on in that whole field. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, very, very much. Okay, we have a bit of time left for questions. Maybe what I'll do, keeping in mind the time, maybe I'll collect a few questions, get some response if there are any more. Would anyone like? Arna, yes. Thank you.
So I'm Arne Melchior from the International Economics Group at NUPI. So thanks for the very interesting presentations. I have one comment and one question. So the comment is about the patterns of trade that you spoke a lot about. So in the kind of stylized talk about it, we say that almost all the manufacturing trade in Asia is in components because of the production networks. And within Europe, you have trade in final goods, and Asia is shipping their final goods out of Asia. So this is kind of true but false because it's not either or, because in all these flows, you have final goods and components. And it's very difficult to measure, actually, because there is no classification saying final goods or intermediate. So when you try to measure it, we put some figures in this Asia study that was mentioned, and there you see there is a kind of degree. So it's true, of course, that components and networks are more important for Asia, but there is a lot of trade in final goods also within Asia. So the Asian consumer has been there already. So yeah, so that's a comment. The question is about commodity. You mentioned interestingly that this share of inter-regional trade in Asia has been flattening out or even falling a little because of the expansion of commodity-driven trade with external partners. My question is, what will happen with this new trend with the falling commodity prices? So we had a kind of decade of expanding global trade because of commodity and partly driven by the commodity price. And Russia had a lot of money, and they could pay for all their imports from Asia. So they shifted from other suppliers, and they bought more from China. So in a sense, my question is, what will happen when Russia cannot afford to pay the bill anymore?
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Arna. Are there other questions? Yes.
Hello, my name is Johan. I'm a visiting research fellow here at NUPI. My question is about the States and its role in both shaping and complicating regionalism in Asia. I just finished my master's at Peking University, and something people love to talk about there is, of course, the belt, but also the TPP. Sorry.
TPP.
Yes,
Yeah.
horrible acronym. And I mean, basically the story there, right, is that it's part of this geopolitical game. You have to see it as basically a competition between the States and China for Asia, and I guess kind of globally too. So how would you comment to that? And then interestingly, you say that you kind of think the TPP is going to fail. Can you go a little bit more and talk about why you think that is? And since, I mean, my professor in China would say that if the TPP fails, it's a huge victory for China. Can you explain a little bit of what implications you think that would have for both China and its role in the region.
Thank you.
Thanks, Johan. Was there another question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. We are from Embassy of Japan in Norway. Thank you very much. And we have several questions about the economic relationship between Japan and China and the European countries. The first one is, the EU and Japan is process of negotiation about EPA now, right? So if it come true, or what kind of and how much impact and opportunities would give to European countries and Japan, vice versa. And the second one is, last question is, the many experts and economists say China's economy is slowing down. So if it's true, investment to China from European countries or across the globe, how it can be development and ongoing, and if the investment to China is slowing down and it decrease, so what such money, the huge amount of money, where such money would go to the another area or part of the globe?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, my learned fellow economist, Javier, thank you very much for that question. Yeah, getting exact figures on production network trade is very difficult, and to get up-to-date ones is also quite difficult. I did actually say not most of East Asia's intra-regional trade is production network trade or component parts trade, but about up to 40% of it. But yeah, on commodity prices, at the moment they're going down, and no doubt in the future they'll go back up again. I mean, they go through these kind of cycles, don't they? And regarding Russia, well, Russia's beginning to become quite an important energy partner for Northeast Asian countries especially, and I see this developing in the future, but they'll just earn less money, I guess, for every cubic meter of gas sold and barrel of oil sold to China, Japan, and possibly South Korea. I really don't know how to predict the future on this, but obviously what's interesting for me in a more broader context is how geographically, if you look at the map just above your head, you can see that the Russian Far East is quite a big part of Northeast Asia, and you have various oil fields around there, okay, and coming down Sakhalin, maybe supplying Japan through pipelines. And energy will be quite an interesting factor or important factor for Russia's relations with East Asia generally. I think you can see this already through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization I mentioned earlier. And likewise, Australia's relationship with Asia is being at the moment shaped by resources trade, just like Russia's is with East Asia, through Australia supplying, I think, up to $50 billion every year of resources to China. Now the sixth largest import trade partner for China. So resources trade actually is a theme in my forthcoming book, and it will be increasingly important, I think, in determining East Asia's relationships, especially China's and Japan's, with those outside. Now, my friend over here about the TPP and the geopolitical game. Why do I think it will fail? Well, I've studied free trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific since the trend began, really, in the early 2000s. I've written quite a bit on this, and I've studied it quite extensively and researched it. The main reason why I think that the TPP could fail is because the US is simply not pragmatic or flexible enough. Because if you look at every single FTA the US has ever signed, it's had an intellectual property rights chapter of at least 8,000 words or about 30 pages long. Most of the provisions derive directly from US domestic legislation on intellectual property, and they are using other areas of their commercial regulation, like investment, on government procurement, and they are basically saying to other countries, you take it or you leave it. So they are saying, quite frankly, to their TPP partners or other 11 APEC member parties on this. We signed an agreement with Korea a few years ago. This is what the TPP will be based on. So a leaked document on IPR 1 or 2 years ago showed that even when they were trying to conclude the agreement back then, and it's already missed 4 end-of-year deadlines, the TPP, don't forget, there were 700 points of contention on that one chapter alone. And most of them were because of the US wanting the other 11 member states to do what it wanted them to do. It's simply not flexible enough. That's the US's main problem. And I really think there's a very strong chance of it failing. Lest we forget what happened almost exactly 10 years ago when the US tried to do a similar deal with the Latin American countries. I don't know if you remember the Free Trade Area of the Americas, the FTAA. It failed. It failed because Brazil and Argentina said, no, we don't want to adopt US domestic legislation, please, on these areas. It's not just the Americans that have got problems on this, right? Our friends from Japan and from other countries in East Asia are not happy about totally liberalizing their agricultural trade. The Australians are not happy, or the New Zealanders, with adopting an investor settlement dispute mechanism, which the US is insisting on in the TPP. And China plays this very smartly. It goes for an agreement which has far more chances of conclusion, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership centered on East Asia. Because even though there are differences of opinion between Japan and China on FTAs, and they're quite different economies still, Japan's being still far more advanced on the whole, is that they both share a similar kind of conceptual approach about how we do economic partnerships, which is based on cooperation, not just about liberalization. They're far more flexible and pragmatic, and dare I say smarter, the East Asians, when it comes to these things. And you may have seen in the last APEC summit, China, somewhat ironically, revitalized the free trade agreement or area of the Asia-Pacific initiative, the FTAAP, which was first proposed by the US government 9 years ago in 2006, although that was originally a business council idea in 2004, but the Chinese picked up on this to try to distract the TPP members from concluding their end of 2014 deal on the TPP. And it's going to miss, again, I guess, this fifth end-of-year deadline coming up this year. And then I think it will be dead after that. I think it will go the same way as the FTAA when the Americans tried to do a similar deal with the Latin Americans. My friends from Japan, hello. So glad you came along. I think that Japan, as I mentioned just now, Japan is although it has some very strong business lobby interest to take into account, and the Japanese business lobbyists, organizations like the Keidanren, will want certain things from an FTA with the European Union. I think that there is quite a strong chance of this FTA being negotiated because the Europeans are quite kind of, a little bit dogmatic on certain issues, as I'm sure you've encountered in your talks with them. But I think that both sides are quite pragmatic, and that some kind of deal will be done. And the benefits could be enormous. It could be the most important FTA globally. If you think about the European Union and Japan being both top 4 global economies, the interactions between both Japan and the EU not just extend to trade, but also investment, finance, science, technology, cultural interchange. And I would expect quite a broad band kind of agreement between both sides, where it wouldn't just have an important economic effect, but also political, social, and cultural effects. So the benefits, I think, would be substantial, depending, of course, on what deal is done. And that's what it comes down to. It's not about whether an FTA is done or not. It's what kind of FTA is done. And this is where the Americans don't quite get it right, in my particular view. I hope we haven't got any Americans here, but if you have, I can explain this in more detail to you. Of course, Mark, are you from the United States?
Close, Canada.
Canada, oh, sorry, God bless you, yes, sorry. Okay. On the Chinese economy slowing down, again, as an economist, I should be able to come up with some predictions, but there are so many variables to take into account. I wouldn't like to kind of say summarize it in one or two snappy sentences. I think, again, it comes back to the question, okay, the GDP growth figure is coming down, but to me, what's more important is what kind of economic growth is China achieving? To me, it's more about quality issues more than quantitative issues. So I think that's actually a far bigger impact than the actual final number, is what kind of economic growth or development is China achieving now? And that connects to climate change and energy, other issues. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've sort of reached the end of our time here. First of all, I want to thank Professor Dent for his very, very fascinating, interesting comments. This is definitely proof that the whole question of how Asia cooperates is far from over. I also want to give thanks to our two discussants, Ren and Otto. Thank you very much for your very valuable additions to this debate. And thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark.
Let me just quickly add that we have further Asia Center events which will be coming up. Please keep an eye on our newly refurbished website, and we hope to see you back at NUPI very soon. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. Thank you very much. I'm so a bit over time.
That's very high quality.